And Mr. Matrushi will be joining us again later. Our next speaker is Florence Eid, who is the editor and CEO of Arabia Monitor, a very leading consultancy in the area. And she has come up with a wonderful title, The Middle East Today, What is Exceptional and What is Not? And you may be surprised by what she has to say. Florence.
Thanks, everyone. My task has been made a lot easier by Mr. Al-Matrushi, who came before me in this panel and has gone ahead and shown the world how much in leading-edge technology we have developing in our region. And on the back of that, what I would like to do is explain the contrast between what is actually happening in our region on the ground, and you've just heard one example, of absolute leading-edge vision in R&D and in technology, and the headlines you're hearing about the region. Somehow it doesn't square, does it? The elephant in the room when we discuss leading-edge technology in our region is, if we read the headlines about the region, it looks like it's really falling apart. So how do we square the two? And how do we parse through developments in the region and explain what is happening in a way that is constructive, let's say? So let me try and do that. A word on Arabia Monitor before I begin. Arabia Monitor is a research firm focused on the Arab countries. We produce research studies and strategy work that help companies do the business they would like to do in our region and understand both the economics and the risk. The uniqueness of Arabia Monitor is that A, it is completely independent, based in London, which adds to its independence, but also it is staffed completely by Arabic speakers from across the region, from Morocco to Algeria, to Syria, to Iraq, to Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, etc. And it is a company I founded after I left JP Morgan, and I'm delighted for the readership we have and delighted to be speaking with you today. Let me now start with a little bit of an outline of what I'd like to share with you. I'll start by explaining what the political map of the Middle East looks like today. The political map of the Middle East has experienced a dramatic transition over the past 5 years, starting with the Arab Spring, going from a region that was sleepy, where nothing ever happened really, to a region that has undergone dramatic transformation in every single country in the region. And I think it's worth going through the political map of the region. The second set of ideas I'd like to share with you is what Nisha already referred to, which is that some of what's happening in our region is truly, truly exceptional. Some of it is really very interesting, but it is not what you're hearing about in the headlines. The bulk of what you hear about in the headlines, I'm afraid, is not so exceptional, and I'd like to walk you through some of this. And finally, I'd like to just explain why there continues to be interest in the region. And the reason why there continues to be interest in the region is not just because people are worried about terrorism emanating from the region, but because this is a 300 million new emerging market that is resourced not just in oil and gas, but also in human resources, the bulk of which are really very much looking toward a better time, and the very tiny minority of which are involved in the bad headlines you hear about every day on the news. So I'd like to show you some of this and explain how regional interest from all over the world, in particular from the large emerging giants, is central to this developing story in the Arab countries. So now let's look at the political map of the region. If you look at these groupings here, there are 5 groupings, 5 different groupings of countries in the region. Previously, it all more or less looked the same. You had monarchies and you had non-monarchies, which were mostly dictatorships. But now the region is divided into 5 different parts. Where you see the fish, you've got countries that have undergone veritable revolutions, and there is reform or attempts at reform being undertaken on the back of a revolution, some with more success than others. Where you see the crowns, those are the constitutional monarchies in the region, and these are constitutional monarchies in the making. Morocco is probably the best example of that today. Where you see green arrows, these are countries that are either constitutional monarchies or control regimes, such as what you have in Algeria under the military, undergoing top-down reform. some more rapidly than others. The change in the GCC countries has been dramatic in terms of the economic and development and the investment horizon in those countries, and there's quite a lot that's taking place in most of these countries that one doesn't hear about. And then you've got a few countries with unknown outcomes. These are the countries that, alas, tend to capture the headlines today: Syria, Iraq as of late, with the ISIS threat emerging and becoming quite serious over the past 2 months. And then you've got countries that are democracies, have been on paper, but there are question marks as to how optimally these countries function. So that's the political map of the region. And the mistake that some people looking at the region from the outside often make is they think of it as a monolith. And these countries are very, very different from each other, some of them evolving in different directions from each other. Now, why is it that interest in the region has not ebbed? Why is it that there's still business interest in the region? And why is it that people are here today? I don't think it's just about oil and gas. I think it's because people understand that there's potential that is beyond the oil and gas story, but it certainly includes the oil and gas story. Now, the countries in green here are today the engines of growth in the region, and they are the oil exporters. But they are the engines of growth not just because they are oil exporters. These countries have always exported oil, I mean, for the past 50 years at least. They are the engines of growth because they are influencing growth in the rest of the region. So, for example, it's not a secret that the economy of Egypt today is thriving on support from the Gulf state, a couple of Gulf states, namely Saudi Arabia and the UAE in this case, and to a smaller extent Kuwait and Qatar. However, the economy of Egypt is a large, diversified economy, and much of what is being put into Egypt is being put into Egypt in the form of investments. So there's quite a lot that is happening intra-regionally by way of support from the countries in green to the countries in yellow and in red that is new to the region, and that is driving forward growth. Now, let me talk a little bit about what is exceptional and what's not. There are 4 points that you hear about all the time that are really not so exceptional, in my view. The first is the revolutions and the Arab Spring. So when the revolutions happened in the Arab world, starting 2011, 2012, people were shocked that there was actually change in that part of the world. Well, this is something we've seen in other emerging markets. We've seen it in Asia, before the emergence of what was called the Asian tigers in the 1970s and 80s. We also saw it in Latin America, when the Latin American countries were democratizing. The dictators of Latin America, such as Pinochet, were removed, replaced by democratic governments, so this is not new. The other thing that's not exceptional are the counter-revolutions. So when Egypt ejected President Mubarak, and elected a president, and this president was then removed, and another general came into power, people were shocked. People were saying, how can this happen? This person was elected, and what's happening now is a counter-revolution. Well, it happened, whether one agrees or not, it happened. And it also is the case that these things are not at all exceptional. So if you look at the history of Latin America, for example, during the 1980s and 90s, you had 2 decades of revolutions and counter-revolutions. Some of them turned into civil wars that extended for about 10 years, like in El Salvador and Bolivia. And some of them were clean revolutions that took place over a period of about 3 to 4 years, such as under Pinochet. That was the cleanest one, when Pinochet was ousted. I myself was working in Chile for the World Bank 2 years after Pinochet was removed, and you could still feel it. You could still feel the transition in Chile. But these things are also not so exceptional. The third bit that is not so exceptional is the emergence of radical Islamist entities on the scene, such as today the grouping that initially called itself ISIS and now has called itself the Islamic State, alternatively the Caliphate that was established in Syria and Iraq a couple of months ago. People don't quite know what to make of this, and are thinking, what's happening? Why is this radical group suddenly having so much influence in the region? This, again, in my view, is not so exceptional. If you look at other regions of the world, associated with religion or not associated with religion. We've had many groupings in history that have come out of revolutions, have been more radical than the mainstream, and captured a lot of spotlight for short periods of time, created enemies, and eventually did not do too well. So, for example, again, in Latin America, you had many of these movements. People forget that, for example, the communist movement in Latin America produced someone called Che Guevara, and Che Guevara was not trying to only create revolutions in Latin America. He also went to Africa to try and transform and you know, mount revolutions and take power in some African countries. These are things we forget today, and we look at what's happening in the Middle East and we think it's exceptional and unique to the Middle East. It's not so unique to the Middle East. It is a problem, and it does have to be dealt with, but it's not so exceptional, in my view. The fourth one that, in my view, is not so exceptional is the spread of political contagion. So the fact that these things have spread initially from Tunisia to Egypt, the Arab Spring, and then today from Syria to Iraq, and you know, possibly even further, these things are also not exceptional because political contagion is inevitable and it is faster in today's world than it has ever been. Now, I'll tell you what is truly exceptional. What is truly exceptional is that in some of these countries, the process has been tremendously linear and surprisingly linear. So, for example, the fact that the GCC states have managed to remain stable is exceptional, and it does have to do with the fact that the GCC states have understood the importance of investment and have understood the importance of pleasing citizens by plowing the money into the economy. This is not dissimilar to what Norway has done, only Norway was a diversified economy when oil came about. The GCC states were not. And so the emphasis on investment, likewise in Morocco, for different reasons in Tunisia, which is a poorer country with much fewer resources, the processes have been remarkably linear, given how important the changes in the Arab world have been. Algeria has also been remarkably linear by pursuing strategies very similar to the GCC states. What is really interesting is the evolving relationship between citizen, state, and religion, and this is exceptional. Between citizen and state, and between religion and citizen, and religion and state. This is absolutely exceptional. I keep saying to people the most important thing that has happened in the Arab world is not the arrival of democracy to some countries, which is sort of limping and still finding its way, but the emergence of pluralism across the Arab world. So, including in the country where I grew up, Saudi Arabia, the degree of pluralism, meaning the amount of debate that one heard when one was young on television and on the radio about the role of Islam in society, the relationship between a Muslim and his own religion, the relationship between Islam and other religions, etc. All of that was a sphere that was sort of a closed box. And today there's a lot more debate that is open, there's a lot more open discussion, and this is what I call pluralism, and it is by far more important than democracy, in my view, in the Arab world today. And we can come back to this point. But I'd like to first link it to what's happening in our region around this phenomenon called ISIS, because that is today the most riveting part of what's happening in the Arab world. And in essence, what you see, if you observe closely, is that quite a few Muslims in the Arab world are opposed to this phenomenon. In fact, the majority, the vast majority, are opposed to this phenomenon because of what it represents by way of a threat to the form of society that we live in today in the Arab countries. And that is interesting. That is pluralism. There used to be a time when opposition to such groupings was a lot more difficult, and now it's not. Now it is not just easier, it is institutionalized, meaning governments are being involved in it. The third truly exceptional component is the massive generational gap that has emerged. So yes, there are young fighters that have joined ISIS and who have their own path that they're taking forward. But you also have a mass among the 300 million. Firstly, the region is about 50% under the age of 30. Huge. So 150 million people under the age of 30. I think it's slightly higher than 150, close to 200 million people under the age of 30. And a lot of young people who don't believe in what is happening and who have departed from the tradition. And this generational gap is stronger than ever. So we have families who are quite conservative, whose children are quite open, and the children choose their own path in life and their own education and their own way of accessing information. And this, in my view, is the silver lining. I think Ms. Akbar is going to speak about that. We do quite a lot of research on entrepreneurship, and you see it there. And the final 2 points I want to make. One is shifting Western engagement. So in the region today, Western engagement was reticent, as you know, in some parts of the region in terms of involvement. Syria, for example. Iraq, it has come, but it has come late, and in forms that are very different from the past. And the teething of regional involvement. And regional involvement, I mean teething for this, because there are trials and tribulations around this. There are ways of doing things and mistakes, and there's a learning curve, etc. And the new big phenomenon in our region is the tale of two hegemons that is emerging. One, of these hegemons is Saudi Arabia and the Gulf included, really, and Iran. And there's a whole new chapter unfolding that is very interesting to talk about, and then I'm very happy to discuss. Finally, there's an economic point I want to bring up that is truly, truly exceptional. And it is that this region, I am almost ready to bet, will have emerged from its transition with practically no debt default and practically no disorderly currency devaluation. That is because of the intra-regional fiscal backbone that emanates from the Gulf and has supported many countries, but also because of the low level of indebtedness. You know that some countries in emerging markets continue to suffer from structural debt defaults, Argentina being the most prominent one among them. Argentina started defaulting during its transition 4 decades ago and continues to default today. Brazil defaulted twice or 3 times before the transition was over. And in the Arab world, we probably will not have a single default. And that is massive in terms of investor confidence. And that is why there's an economic story beyond oil and across the region. Now, let me just, I'll conclude, Nisha. I probably have, 4 minutes? Let me just conclude by showing you some of the external international factors that solidify this emerging market story. Firstly, a step back. These countries in dark blue that you see here on the map are the ones whose exposure to Europe in terms of trade is the highest. Okay. And the darkest countries, Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya here, are the ones who have more than 51% exposure. So on the eve of the Arab Spring, during the financial crisis, Tunisia was exporting 80% of everything it produced to Europe, and Morocco was exporting 75% of everything it produced to Europe. Okay. Nobody predicted the Arab Spring, but we did publish 1 year prior to it, out of Arabia Monitor, that with Europe slowing down to zero growth, it was going to be a problem for economies like Tunisia in particular. Because how do you export to a partner slowing down to zero growth if you're heavily dependent on them? And sure enough, a year later, the Arab Spring began. Now, why do I say this? I say this because it's connected to the new growth story here. I'll show you in a moment, but Morocco, for example, is producing something called the Casablanca Finance Center, which is similar to its own Dubai, focused on Africa in order to leverage the growth in West Africa and diversify its economy from trade with Europe toward trade with Africa. One major development this week is that China has decided that a branch of the Bank of China will be opened in Morocco, for example. And the China story is extremely central to what you see in the Arab world today. Now, what has this meant? This has meant that these countries used to produce, here, this is North Africa down here, the bulk of what they produced for Europe, and the Gulf states imported the bulk of what they imported from Europe and from Asia. These are 3 areas of trade, while intra-regional trade, these dotted lines over here, was absolutely minimal. So there was very little going from Morocco to the Gulf states and vice versa. This was the structural problem in the economy of the region. Now, if you take a look at what's happening in Chinese growth, let's take one example that illustrates quite a lot. The growth of Chinese food imports between 2001 and 2011, this is when the data was available. If you look at this chart here, you find a growth rate of 800%. So 800% in growth of Chinese food imports. If you take a look at how much China was importing from the Arab countries, in particular Tunisia and Morocco in this case, you find that there were two upward sloping graphs like this, so somewhat in the right direction with a bit of volatility. Only food exports from Tunisia and Morocco to Europe, here in this chart, is in billions, and to China it's in millions. So it's all well and good to have two lines going up in the same direction, but the order of magnitude for China is absolutely minuscule. So this tells you what the opportunity is. And here we're not saying, bananas to China, we're saying processed food, agro-industries, etc., meat, the things that the Chinese import. Now, let me then conclude by just showing you how the UAE is one example of a trade hub with Africa. This is the other emerging market. So Africa is playing a central role, and also as a stopping point for entrepot trade from China. And finally, the China story is best illustrated, I think, through this proportion of Dubai hotel occupancy from different countries in the world. If you take a look at the growth of Chinese hotel occupancy in Dubai, for example, that's 900% growth compared with all the others. So why don't I stop here and see if there are any particular questions you'd like to take now. And I think Nisha has in mind for us to have a panel discussion afterwards, but if there are one or two you'd like to take now, I'm very happy to take them.
Fantastic presentation, Florence.
Thank you.
Who'd like to put the first question?
No question is a bad question. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very good presentation. My name is Rolf Hansen. Could you say a little bit about sort of the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as a factor in all of these developments that you have been describing? Thank you very much.
That's a very good question, and that is the most difficult question. I was hoping no one would ask it. But yes, the rivalry is rife, and it's on multiple fronts. Some of these fronts are legitimate. Iran is a large, populous, well-diversified economy that is, if opened, is highly competitive. And that is a legitimate rivalry, because if and when Iran opens up, and if that opening up is complete, which we don't think it'll happen overnight, the Gulf states have either a lot to benefit from or a lot to worry about, because Iran is an economy that is large and diverse. Now, on the political front, the rivalry can be divided into two components. I think one is security-related and geostrategic, and that, once again, is legitimate, because countries do worry about their neighborhoods, and inevitably so. But there is also a rivalry that goes back centuries, which is religious, which is the Shia-Sunni rivalry, and which over the centuries has sometimes been played up and sometimes come down. So we conducted a study looking at trade between Iran and Saudi Arabia, for example, over the past 600 years. And there were times where trade was thriving. Things were going very, very well. And there were times when the religious rivalry precluded trade, where trade practically ground to a halt. And we've seen, in recent times, many episodes of this, in particular after the revolution in Iran. Under the Shah, there were some very, very good couple of decades, and prior to that. So there are multiple components to this rivalry. It's not going to go away, in my view. It has to be understood, managed, and possibly leveraged. Now, some of the countries in the Gulf have natural ties with Iran through families that are originally Iranian or Shia populations that are doing very well in the Gulf countries. And so those are the rays of hope, in my view, for establishing a better relationship between the Gulf and Iran. Because to me, it would seem like an inevitability if Iran comes back into the international fold, which Iran is trying very hard to do.
Florence, we have another question over here.
Thank you. It's Walid Nasser from the Petroleum Administration in Lebanon. Thank you for the presentation. Since we are in an oil and gas conference, I would have loved to see some analysis about the impact or the effect of oil and gas in bringing stability to some areas such as the GCC countries, or instability and chaos to other areas, like in the Eastern Mediterranean with what's happening in occupied Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, Iraq, and in Libya and Northern Africa. So what do you think is, because of these resource-rich countries, would oil and gas be a factor of stability or instability, and the influence, the global influence on that? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. It's
a very big question.
Yeah.
So a brief answer, please,
I'll answer it briefly. I'll answer it briefly and try to do it justice. But very good question. I think, based on what I've said, you can probably conclude that my view is that oil and gas have brought stability to the Gulf, because oil and gas have been well deployed in the Gulf, and when the time came to deploy them, meaning the revenue from oil and gas, A, abroad in terms of sovereign wealth investments, but B, regionally, which is a novelty, in order to help stabilize the region, I would say, by and large, it's been a stabilizing factor. There is the element that I mentioned here, which is the teething of regional involvement by some of the Gulf states, which are now well-armed, influential, have the money, etc. This is a process where states have to learn how to walk before they run, and we're watching carefully to see how all of this is done. Involvement in Libya is one example. It's a double-edged sword. With respect to the Eastern Mediterranean, to be honest, my personal view is that there's so much instability already there that it's not clear to me that a gas find for Lebanon is going to necessarily add to the instability in any major way. I think that the instability is ingrained in the region for the time being. Things are not getting better anytime soon. And it's hard to say, but if I were to take a bet, I would think it should be, by and large, another stabilizing factor.
Florence, for now, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
There are many more questions for you, but people will just have to sit on them for now. Remember your questions, and you can put